Hey, everybody. Welcome back to On the Defense, the podcast where we look at the intersection of cybersecurity and finance. If you're joining us for the first time, this is a great place to start because in this episode, we speak with Damian Seaton, Managing Director and founder of Audit Team, a leading cybersecurity company based in Australia's own Brisbane. This discussion is full of really practical defense tips for protecting both our businesses and ourselves in our personal lives, especially since now the lines between work and home life aren't always super distinct. Damian shares lots of real-world examples and also has some interesting insights into training and how to go about it. So have a listen and, stay safe out there. Damian, thanks so much for joining us today. Really excited to have you on the show. I thought we could start by just getting an overview of who you are, who is Audit Team, and what's your role there? What do you do?
So my name is Damian Seaton. I'm the Managing Director and founder of Audit Team. We've been going for about just over 7 years now. We're an end-to-end cybersecurity, information security business. So we provide a range of solutions to customers of all sizes, particularly the SME market. Anything from governance, risk and compliance assessments through to full managed detection response, cybersecurity services, incident response, and also providing Australian bespoke training to those businesses so they can identify, the threats within, not just within their businesses, but also for their staff in their personal lives as well.
Okay, great. And how did you come to start an organization like that? What's your background?
So my background's ex-intelligence services and also military and police. And about 22 years ago, I moved to Australia and I started working in digital forensics and e-discovery, electronic discovery. And we were working with the majority of law firms around Australia, but also ASIC, ATO, ACCC. From there, we were doing more forensic work. And about 8 years ago, an opportunity arose when cyber was more information security. It hadn't really been named cybersecurity, and lots of colleagues and owning businesses were starting to realize that this was going to be something that they needed to look at. And so we started with the company, Audit Team, assessing organizations to identify their risk and then give them some practical guidelines around mitigating those risks, looking at the compliance obligations that they had, and giving them practical and affordable solutions based on their size of their organization, their industry, and their budget. And very quickly, the business grew from that then into providing the consulting services, the managed services, and it just keeps growing from there.
Okay, great. Well, you just touched on something, the affordability and the practicality of security solutions and working with SMEs. I'm curious to know, obviously it sounds like you've worked with a really broad range of organizations, but would you say that when it comes to smaller businesses, do you feel like the cyber risks and the challenges are different in any way? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are differences, clearly. I mean, we would like to think that some of the larger organizations have the budget and expenditure to address this. But as we've seen with many data breaches over the last 2 to 3 years, there are still gaps. For the smaller businesses, I think there's a false sense of security in our expertise here and what we witness, that sometimes they're told, either internally by IT or externally by a managed service provider, that they're all good. Now, we all need our IT colleagues, but I think there's a lack of awareness and professional development in this area, and cybersecurity and IT are very different. Yet we've turned as businesses to those IT providers because cybersecurity often conjures up this idea that we're talking about technology. And whilst there is some technology there, that the information that we hold, it sits in technology, it sits in the cloud, sits on servers, sits on our laptops. It's how our users access it. And then that comes down to policy, process, procedure, training. But it also comes down to a number of other factors as well, and that sits outside of IT's realm. The easiest way for a small business to think of it is an analogy that if you were up for a criminal offence, you've been arrested, and you have a friend who's a lawyer, but that lawyer is a conveyancing lawyer. You're not going to bring that person in to help you. They both studied law, but they're very different. Now, they might work together, and it's the same with IT and cyber. Small businesses need to, identify, does their MSP, their managed service provider, or their internal IT have the skill set, the tools, the understanding? If they do, that's fantastic. But often they don't. And so it's about partnering with experts that can bring that diversity and those skills, knowledge, and expertise to assist.
Right. Yeah, that's something that comes up a lot, I feel, especially when we have spoken with, for instance, small business owners. Even one that was on this very show has said that they kind of felt like they were safe because, they had talked to their managed service provider about using Microsoft Office and everything is good. It's all secure and you're fine. And then you mentioned that some of this doesn't even, we think, oh, it's technology, therefore tech people will help us make sure it's secure. But some of this doesn't exactly sit comfortably within, IT, and not all of it's related to, just tech. So how does that impact finance and AP employees specifically, especially since a lot of those people are the people who are actually listening right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, that comes down to policy, process, procedure, training then. So you can put certain technologies in place, but what we need to look at is defense in depth. So think of it like your house. You don't just have a door, you might have a lock. You then might have CCTV, lights, dogs, walls, a safe in the house. It's up to you how much defense you put in. For those APs, for the finance people, they will have certain processes for things like, BSB account changes, that sort of stuff. But it's also understanding that the criminals know these processes because we're easy to be deceived. I've been in this industry now for over 30 years. I'm not saying that it would be impossible for me to be deceived. I could be deceived at the right moment, in the right time, with the right information. Somebody's gathered information on me. I could be deceived. And so it's understanding that we're not trying to stay one step ahead of the criminals. We're actually trying to get into the same sports field as them. We're not even in the same sports field. They are highly motivated. They're highly skilled. They are highly financed, and they're highly intelligent as well. And so they now, with lots of advents of whether it's artificial intelligence or machine learning, they can understand what the process is and callback processes are the ones that we see in a lot of businesses. When they say we've got robust systems, we've got callback processes, but we've seen instances where the criminals understand those callback processes, and they might send an email from a legitimate customer who's been breached. They send out a business email, compromise email to an accounts payable of a business, knowing that there is an imminent invoice that needs paying. And knowing those callback processes will ring to then socially engineer one of the AP staff to say, as per our protocols, this is a phone call to confirm that the email we've just sent is legitimate. And they'll know the person that they've been talking to. And so that can circumvent it because whilst there has been a callback, it wasn't the AP person that initiated the call. It was the customer or the criminal. And so very simple things like that can only come through training and awareness. So you can't cover that with technology. And this is where, to your question, it's a good question, is that technology isn't going to protect against that. It's continued awareness of understanding what we call the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the criminals. And ensuring then that we test those processes, not to catch the staff out, but to ensure that if we've put a process in place, is it robust? Can it be circumvented?
Right. That is, I guess you mentioned that they're highly motivated, highly well-financed, organized, et cetera. So when we talk about the criminals who are using these tactics, these procedures, who understand these processes, who are they? Are they, and what are their motivations? Because often what we hear from small businesses is, well, why would anybody target us? Like, we don't have any state secrets. We're not a big brand. We don't have billions of dollars. There's not a big corporation. So why would these people care about us if they're so smart? Like, who would care about us? Only people that would target us are maybe somebody in their mom's basement, just a rogue actor. Is that accurate?
So what's accurate there is the perception by a lot of customers, a lot of small businesses, that they don't have anything. So that's accurate. Mm. We hear that a lot. We hear things, and you mentioned it earlier on, we're in the cloud. We use Microsoft or with Apple and they're secure. Well, yes, those businesses are secure, but they have what is called a shared responsibility model. How do your users, as a customer, access their information? So in terms of the original question and who's targeting you, we've got to stop thinking about you being targeted. When a criminal attacks a business, it's generally, think of phishing. So phishing is an email that goes out to hundreds and thousands, if not millions of customers in the hope or potential victims that somebody clicks on that email, interacts with the email, has some interaction. So that's not targeted. That's untargeted in the hope. And often these are how they don't have spelling mistakes these days. They're very well crafted. They can come from banks, trusted organizations, institutions. So that's the phishing. Then we've got what we call spear phishing, where there's a little bit more understanding of your business. Maybe it's using your first name. Maybe they've already breached a company and they're sending emails out from that company, and the company doesn't even know they've been breached. So there's many different layers of criminality here. They also don't just exist overseas. These criminals sit here in Australia. We have Australian criminals, which a lot of businesses neglect to understand, whether that's organized crime, whether that's sophisticated criminals or unsophisticated criminals, realizing that this is really simple. For the small business that thinks they have nothing, let's take a small business that could be a small financial practice, accountancy. Well, they've got lots of customers. So I'm not going to target that accountant's practice because they've got information or they've got money to ransomware, but I'm going to target because I can use them as a conduit to get to the next business and the next business and the next business. This is like a domino. Once you get in, if I get into the email system, I can see every email that's ever been sent, every email in the inbox, every folder structure. And what a lot of businesses in IT forget is, oh, they only got into my email. Well, if they got into your email with a username and password that they somehow got, they can get into the web application. If they get into the web application, they're into everything. They're into OneDrive, SharePoint. And that small business that we talk about, regardless of whether they have information or not, it's who do they deal with? If it's a small business, do they have any bigger customers? Do they have high net worth individuals, people of interest? Because this is a luck game. You throw a net out there and you don't know what you're going to catch. Sometimes you don't catch very much. Sometimes you catch the little fish that allows you then to catch the big fish. And this is what small businesses need to get their head around, is because they don't think they have any information, they don't know what the long-term opportunity is for the criminal. And the path to least resistance is every criminal's opportunity. And they're financially motivated. And we're not doing cybersecurity very well in Australia, full stop, because of that attitude. I don't have any information. Who would want to target me? And it's the same as, who would want to break into my house? I don't have anything. Do you have a car? Do you have a passport? Do you have a driver's license? Do you have a tax file number? All of this is of use. I can give you one example that's public of a company, I won't mention it, but said that they don't have very much information. And they didn't. This was one of the largest meatpacking companies in Australia and globally. And there wasn't much information that they held. But what they did have was a lot of operational technology in this instance. So what the criminals did is they shut every meatpacking facility down in Australia. And very quickly, they paid around about $15 million to the criminals. But they didn't hold any information. That's an example of ransomware.
Wow. Yeah. It's massive. Yeah.
That is. But then small business might say, well, I don't have any money to ransomware. Okay. Well, what are you insured for?
Yeah.
$200,000 cyber insurance, $100,000. That's a good payday.
Right. Yeah.
So I might ransomware you for $100,000 because I've got your insurance documents.
Yeah. Wow.
So it's trying to understand, how do criminals think? Once we start to look at that, then we can understand what risk do we have. And I think taking that back one stage further, it's understanding what information do we have? What information do we collect? Who has access to that information? And what sort of value would we put on it? Because we're not just thinking about credit cards here, we're thinking about personally identifiable information. And then we've got to look at the obligations around compliance and legalities as well.
Yeah, I think I really like your analogy of, yeah, you may not have like a ton of money or something in your house, but you would still lock the door because you definitely have something of value in there to someone. And particularly when we are talking about the business community and all these different organizations that are the supply chains and how everything is kind of this ecosystem of interconnectedness, there's always going to be something in any organization that could be used for criminal purposes, even if they're not kind of like the end target, if you want to use that term. But I guess from there, what I'm wondering about is I often, when we talk about security strategy and things that people can do with smaller organizations, with small businesses, a lot of them are like, look, I'm worried about cash flow. I'm worried about this. I'm worried about chasing invoices from people who haven't paid yet. Like there's so many existential things that they're constantly worried about. I'm wondering what are some practical things that they can do, because they often don't have, the resources, the head count. Maybe they don't even have the awareness because they don't know what they don't know. So what can they be doing practically? If a small business leader is hearing this and going, well, I would like to protect my organization, but I don't even know where to start. What would your tips be for them?
Yeah, again, some good questions. I think the first thing is to understand, what's the size of the business? What information do we hold? But what we see time and time again are a few things where businesses just don't have anything in place. So the first thing that we would say is, look, you need to employ a password manager, okay? Because out of every business, and we do a lot of training nationally, and every time we go around, we work with CPA Australia, we've worked with many large organizations to talk to small businesses. And I would say about 90% of the time when I ask with Chatham House rules for the audience to show me by a show of hands how many people are using a password across multiple sites in their business and their personal lives perhaps, about 85 to 90% of people still put their hands up. So that's the first thing. That means that if you're using a password that is made up of something that so that could be names, dates of birth, football teams, colors, animal names, anything that you've made up, we've made up, it's not difficult to grab that information and access that information if you're using it across multiple sites. Password Manager allows you to create long, complex passwords that a generator in the Password Manager generates for you. Then, for every account that you have to log into, whether it's your MyOb, your Xero, your banking, your social media, your Salesforce, whatever you're using, each account has a unique password. That's a start, okay? And this is where businesses are failing, because changing passwords on a regular basis doesn't work. And we don't need to change the passwords if they meet long, complex guidelines.
Right.
The only time we change a password is if that company to which that password is relevant to tells us they've had a data breach or an incident, and then we go in and change it quickly. But this is where we haven't caught up with the rest of the world, or we've had some misinformation to start with. And back in the day, so if we go back to the 60s when passwords were invented to protect one device, one instance, that was okay, let's say. But now the average user has over 100 accounts. So it's understandable why we use password 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, March 2024. We come up with very poor passwords. And that's one of the major reasons that most businesses and people are breached, is because of that password hygiene.
Wow. And that's a lot of organizations even have policies that say it's an automatic thing where the user has to change their password, let's say every month or every quarter or whatever it is. But is that contributing to people just kind of maybe just using password 1, 2, 3, 4 and then 5, 6, 7, 8 for the next one?
And I think you've answered that question there. So I'm not going to belittle people's policies because this came from maybe IT or someone telling us. And back in the day, that was the thing to do, wasn't it? We changed the passwords. Well, we now have to look at where we're at today.
Yeah.
And today, the criminals have software, they have techniques, they have social engineering, they have ways to get this information from us or elicit it from us. So that doesn't work anymore. So we have to look at something and go, is it still fit for purpose? Well, changing passwords or putting a policy in to say you must change your passwords every 30 days, 45 days, whatever it is, does a number of things. One, it decreases productivity because I've got to change the password. And there's stats out there that will say the average user in a business can spend up to 14 hours a year changing passwords. And then if they have to change the password, how many passwords do I have to change? And what ends up happening is that the average person will choose something, because we're having to do this on a regular basis, that's really simple to guess or to extract. And to your point, yes, I've now got to change the password to that account again. So what was it? It was password 1234. I'm now going to change it to 456, or I'm going to capitalize something. Or what we see is things like, March 2024, April 2024, just because we can't remember. So we need to make them really simple. Yeah. So the strategy there around passwords is to put a password manager in and to use that. And then you'll get some people that will say, well, they're not safe either. They've had incidents of being breached. But no password manager that has been breached has ever lost the passwords or gained access to it. So that's what we need to remember. And the alternative is saying, well, I'm happy to keep using that password and variations of that password, because people say, well, I've got variations you wouldn't guess. But that is just not practical when you've got so many. Yeah. So we haven't seen one instance where we've taken a business, demonstrated to their staff how easy this is, both in their professional lives and then in their personal lives, to ensure that their banking, their social media, their Netflix account, their PlayStation account, all have unique passwords. And it actually makes it much easier because we don't have to remember anything. We just remember one passphrase that gets us into that vault. And it's a vault then that we can store everything in. And for the customers that say, people, oh, well, they've been breached. Do you use Microsoft? They've been breached. Do you use LinkedIn? They've been breached. Apple, Westpac. I mean, you can go on and on and on. They've all had breaches. It's how a company deals with a breach and informs the customer about what's happened, the transparency, the openness, the honesty, and then the investment to ensure that doesn't happen again, allows us to remain with those companies, because we can then say, well, look, this could happen to anybody. You've been very open and transparent, and we then can make an informed decision as to whether we stay with that business or go elsewhere. But passwords would be the first thing. And then in line with that, you have to ensure that you've got multi-factor authentication enforced. So we're not talking about two-factor, which is just a text PIN number that comes to you. This is what we call strong MFA, which means that it's something that so your username and password, together with something that you inherently possess, so potential facial ID or biometrics, and then something that you have, and that could be on your phone. It could be the authenticator, Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, or an RSA key for your bank, or a YubiKey. These take seconds to actually use. But again, this is the defense in depth, because even if somebody did have your username and password, without those next levels of security, they may not be able to get in. But remember, it's not a silver bullet. It's, again, just another layer, because we can circumvent or extract some MFA credentials.
Right. That totally goes back to your point earlier about how there isn't really a silver bullet. There's just kind of taking several different approaches and layering them, like you said, to ensure that, yes, there is no single perfect, flawless system or control that's going to protect against every conceivable attack. But layering them is, and I also love the acknowledgement that coming up with actually secure passwords is difficult, and remembering them across all these different platforms. I mean, even in your personal life, I strongly encourage my partner to update all of her passwords and to make them a little bit more secure. And very shortly, she was like, this is too complicated to manage all of these different,
Yeah.
like really complex passwords. So I think a password
Yeah.
manager, that makes so much sense for a small business where people, maybe don't have as much budget or they don't have as much time to be spending on things. That seems like a really quick, easy win in terms of efficiency and security.
It's less than a cup of coffee a month, a couple of cups of coffee. So you could say between sort of $6 to $10 a month for a password manager per staff member. But you can then, you're looking at productivity gains as well. You're also looking at reducing frustration on both the IT, internal or external, and the staff going, oh, I forgot my password, I need to reset it. That takes a lot of time and effort, but it's also causing frustration. It's also making sure that we bring the business and staff along on that journey and show them how this is going to make their lives much easier and give them examples. Because to your point there, we've got a lot. We've probably got more in our personal lives than we do in our professional lives. But now our personal lives and professional lives are intertwining because we might be at work or working from home. And then what we're doing is we're exposing both our lives. So the simple thing is by putting some practical guidelines that government agencies use these password managers, in Australia, large corporations use them. It's understanding that they're there as a benefit and it's going to make lives easier, but it's also going to make us compliant. It's going to show our stakeholders as well, and that third parties, that we're doing the right thing. Because even now, if we start saying, yes, we change passwords every 30 days, well, some businesses will, why are you doing that? Why are you not using the password manager? Because that's what you should be doing. So it's making sure that we look at our processes, we look at the controls and mechanisms, and we have to evaluate, are they still fit for purpose in today's environment? And not using a password manager wouldn't cut the mustard with us working with a company if you didn't use one. And a lot of businesses now, regardless of size, even some of these SMEs that might have some bigger customers, are now being asked, can you show us how you mitigate the risk of our brand being damaged or us being data breached because of the relationship that we have? So it's about getting on the front foot, but these are still affordable, practical solutions that together, as you say, the defense in depth, layered, will make it a little bit more difficult for somebody to attack us. And you can keep adding those based on your budget and risk appetite and what you're trying to achieve. And yes, they all add up in cost, but these are practical both for families and for small businesses and affordable.
And I'm curious, because you gave an example a little while ago of a small business that kind of misunderstood what sort of incentive cyber criminals might have to be interested in them at all. And I think it's so helpful when we hear these examples. And so I'm wondering if you do have any other examples of something where maybe security went wrong, or best of all, maybe a positive example of a small business who has actually done this correctly, that has found affordable solutions, and the training in particular seems like an interesting one, especially, for time poor business leaders and SMEs. Do you have examples of people getting it right or wrong, conversely?
Let's talk about two parts then. So yes, definitely examples for both. I think where companies have got it wrong is firstly where they think no one's going to target us. We've got everything in place. IT says we're fine. And as a business owner myself, just because somebody tells me we're fine, I would like now attestation. I would just like to see, because we do have compliance obligations. We have fiduciary duties as directors and officers. We have ASIC guidelines. We have the Office of the Australian Information and Privacy Commissioner guidelines that we have to put the right controls and mechanisms in place. So just because we have an IT company that works with us and we make sure that they're secure, and we make sure we're secure as well, and we have independent people look at us to make sure we're doing as much as we can. So I think first of all is getting past that false sense of security that somebody has told us that we're fine. And it's not saying, well, I don't understand technology or how data works. If most of us understand risk and governance, risk and compliance, all we've got to do is use any of the frameworks that are out there, the Essential 8, ISO 27001, NIST framework, to identify our gaps. The example I can give you is a company that had put all this in place, or thought that they'd put it in place, had spent money on their systems, but had not really employed any cybersecurity experts. They'd employed IT. Now, this isn't IT bashing in any way. There was no independence. This organization did the company's IT, and they probably did what they thought was the best that they were doing best practice. The issue was that they left a lot of gaps in the organization. So there was no independence in terms of what was secured. And the company I'm thinking about is in real estate. And what had happened was that this one person who worked in a real estate office was working from home, and their social media at home had been breached. So they're working from home with a corporate device. Now, let's say for argument's sake that the real estate agent and the IT had secured that head office. When that corporate device was taken out of that office and taken home, didn't really have any security. And when it connected to the home network, which had been breached because the people there at home, I don't remember exactly what had happened, but I think that the social media had been breached. They clicked on a link. Their shared computer at home was breached. And then that allowed them to breach the corporate device. When that corporate device was breached and went back into the corporate network, they gained access to everything in that real estate agent. And this is a large known real estate agency. From there, what they were able to do was intercept landlord payments. So from the tenant to the landlord, and change internally, so no one recognized it, the BSB accounts and everything else. And they got away with significant funds. So I think having that false sense of security, having some independence, partnering with somebody to come in, to look at it, to assess it, doesn't need to be expensive, doesn't need to be long, is a really good tip for those ones. That's one where somebody didn't get it right. There are multiple other examples where, we can look at professional firms, so lawyers, accountants, thinking again about who do they have in their network. If we're looking at a baker or a hairdresser or someone really small, the chances are that they may not be a target or having information. And one thing that we did mention is what the motivation is: financial. So cyber criminals have one motivation, it's financial. So blackmail, fraud, deception, but it's all around finance. So that's what they're after. And they don't care whether they extract $100 from you or $1 million plus. Every dollar counts. So again, going back to, I don't have anything. Well, you have a business. What is the business worth to you? If it turns over 100,000, it's worth maybe $100,000. If there's an invoice going out for $5,000 or $500, I can intercept that in a couple of minutes. That's good return on my investment. So getting it right is really important. Talking about getting it right, we work with a number of businesses of all sizes, but one comes to mind where they approached us and said, look, I think we've got a lot of things in place here, but we'd like you to come in and have a look and help us identify any gaps so we can remediate those. That was very mature of the organization. Number one, realizing that, internally they were doing the right things. It was a decent size, medium-sized business. But very quickly, we were able to identify gaps, and not to point fingers at anybody that had internal IT and external MSP. It was about collaboration. It was about having the maturity to look for these gaps and to then put in the right controls and mechanisms. And what then happened is one of their brokers in insurance was accused by a customer of being the breach. So the customer accused the broker of breaching them because the broker had sent an email out that the customer had clicked on, and that in turn breached the customer. Because the insurance brokerage had employed us and had put the security in place, within 20 minutes of us being advised that this had allegedly happened, we were able to investigate it and categorically assure and give evidence to the brokers that it was actually the customer who had been breached, and the email had come internally and they'd been deceived because the criminals were in their system, which we could prove through the IP addresses, and that they'd been deceived because they had very little security. They had a shared account which means the same password was used by multiple people to get into an admin account. And they'd got away with about $9,000, small business. But $9,000 to them was quite a lot of money. And that was a payment that they made, which hadn't gone through, which meant they had to pay it again.
Right.
So they were out of pocket $18,000 technically.
Yeah, wow.
And we could talk about many, many examples of where companies get this wrong. And then it's not about whether there's a regulatory compliance or whether ASIC are going to come down hard on us. It's that trust that's eroded. So whoever we partner with, we've lost that trust. And if it gets into the domain, because we have to inform the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner now under the privacy principles, then there's brand damage and reputational damage. And even if someone says, well, we're insured, well, how much are you actually insured for? What are you insured for? How much have you got for social engineering? Is it enough? Because we've got instances where companies said they've got insurance, but there was a shortfall because they lost $1 million, but were only insured for $250,000 in that particular area.
Yeah.
So they had to make up 750 and they couldn't, and they went bust.
Wow. Yeah, that's so confusing when it comes to those insurance policies, because I think that goes back to what you're saying about that false sense of security or that false sense of confidence where you think, oh, I'm covered. This is secure, and I took out a cyber policy, so I'm good. I'm golden. We're safe. And so I think, that kind of touches on the importance of awareness and knowing what you don't know, or knowing if there could potentially be gaps. And I think that kind of goes back to the training portion of things that you mentioned, because a lot of this isn't just technology. It's not about understanding how a certain system or a certain type of software works. It's about understanding these larger ideas. And so what does good training look like? What would be a good way to go about training in an SME?
First of all, we've got to look at how are we delivering training? Is it fit for purpose? We've worked with some companies that say, yeah, we do cybersecurity training, and when they're onboarded, they sit through 4 hours of training. Well, who's going to sit through 4 hours? And how do we measure what they understood? And if we're only doing that once a year, are they retaining that information that they've been trained in? And look, we know in training statistics that after 45 days, you lose 75% of what you've been trained in the knowledge. So these statistics, for any training, this is why if you look at paramedics, if you look at law enforcement, if you look at financial, there's continued professional development, there's regular training. Even the paramedics have to do their regular CPR training. Well, they're paramedics, but they have to carry on that training. The tactics, techniques, and procedures in cybersecurity aren't the same. They change on a regular basis. The attack vectors, the landscape changes on a daily basis. So we have to ensure what good looks like is what's current in Australia. Is the training that we're delivering Australian or is it American? Is it relevant to us? Is it infantile? Because sometimes we see the training and it's cartoon. As a director of a business or a senior leader in the business, will that resonate with me? Is it one hat fits all? Is there training on accounts payable? Is there training to demonstrate to them what the tactics, techniques, and procedures are right now, how the criminals would phone up? Is there a way to test it? We've trained them, but how do we test that training, their knowledge? How do we practical? Again, not to catch them out or embarrass them, but to reinforce it. And again, there's a lot of guidelines to say that how it has to be continuous, it has to be measurable. And this comes from ASIC. Yes, it depends on the size of the business, but with the recent changes in the privacy, nearly every business is going to have to do this because we're not doing it well, and lots of businesses are being breached. And it's not just, well, we lost a bit of information. That information has a major negative impact on us. If it's your information that was lost, or we lost some customers' information, that then criminals can go out and open bank accounts because the information led to them being able to get a driver's license or ID or identity theft. It's understanding what happens to this information and how this information is used, so we don't become blasé. Well, we just lost some email information, or they access the emails. And I think by looking at what is the training that we're delivering per department, how are we training the board? If the business has got a board, how do we train them to ask the right questions of the staff, of the IT providers, of their managed security providers? How do we look at what's good look like? So we can have good, better, best. As long as we start somewhere, what does good look like today in terms of training, and then build it up? And it has to be short and sharp and measurable, because nobody wants to sit through hours of training, not when they're busy and they've got KPIs. But if we can make it 90 seconds, 120 seconds, a couple of minutes, and we can reinforce that message through multiple videos, because we like to consume videos these days. So are they videos, real life videos? Do they get the message across? Does it resonate with the staff? I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I love the point about not just tailoring the training for, is this appropriate for an Australian audience? Is this appropriate for this vertical? But also talking about the different roles within the organization, because I feel like we often don't hear a lot about the difference that you have with training for the intern versus the intern or versus the training for the board of directors or for an executive. What is that different? Because they have such different roles and they have different challenges. And yeah, I think that makes so much sense to be like really examining the type of training you're doing and the relevance that it has, rather than it just being a tick box, is this relevant to people's day-to-day job, and is it right for them, and is this impactful?
And we changed it a while ago. So we used to do, come in and help businesses. And 3 or 4 years ago, we noticed that the training we were delivering wasn't really resonating with the workers. And so what we quickly pivoted was to, instead of talk about protecting the business and why you need to do this, is we changed the training to show the staff how to protect themselves and their family. And by doing that, we had 100% uptake.
Wow.
By showing the staff that, look, yes, we want you to be vigilant in the organization, but via osmosis, what we found is by pivoting it to say, look, the business is investing in cybersecurity information training for you and your family. They brought that same level of awareness and vigilance into the business naturally. So looking at how to train mum and dad, people in their sort of late 50s to their sort of 80s are a big target, because they are vulnerable, because they don't really understand technology like some of the younger generation or demographics. They may be easier to deceive in terms of, this is Damian from Telstra or the NBN or ANZ Bank, and there's been an issue with your account. I'm from the fraud department. I'm here to help. They are willing to listen. They can't spot the scams as well. I'm not saying that we can all spot them. So if we can train the parents, ourselves, our children and our siblings to show them that, look, this is real. They're targeting us in every aspect of our lives, because again, $50, $100 times a couple of thousand a day all adds up. But equally, then by training them, showing them simple, practical methods of securing their social media, making things private, showing them that what I can get from what we call open source intelligence, or OSINT, by literally looking online and gathering information from your socials and your LinkedIn, there's often enough information that would allow me to steal your identity, or develop enough information about you that I could deceive your family that something's happened to you and they need to transfer money to me. Or I could convince you that I know you and I develop a relationship in terms of a professional relationship where I've gained your trust. The old confidence tricksters. So there's enough information on your socials by showing you how easy it is to lock that down, what the benefits are, not from your family and friends and people you already know, but from people who you wouldn't. If I stopped you in the street and said, what's your date of birth? Where do you live? What's your partner called? Where do your children go to school? What are your favorite sports, television shows, all that allow me to build a profile up? You would probably tell me to go away and not be very polite about it. But we're doing that in our socials. We're putting all that information and we don't put a value on it, but the criminals do put a value on it.
Right.
So that's where the training needs to go, I think, is train the staff. Sure, we want them to protect the business, but they have to buy into it. They have to want to be invested into that. And that was something we adopted, very early on.
Well, that I think that's such a good point, especially because of something that I think you already highlighted, which is that the boundaries between our personal lives and our professional lives are so porous. And so therefore, a lot of the digital boundaries between those two areas are very porous. And, you mentioned the example of the employee who had been breached through their social. And so that was then a business risk. I mean, these things are increasingly intertwined, it seems. So it completely makes sense, not just from a buy-in perspective, but also even from the business's perspective and the incentive that they have to help their employees protect themselves and their families. That makes a lot of sense, to the point where I'm now wondering why that isn't more like a more common approach, because it makes so much sense to think about it that way, because they are so increasingly enmeshed. But just to take a step backwards and kind of zoom out just a little bit, I feel like this is on a very much a micro level when we talk about the individual employees and their families and homes. But when we zoom out and we look at where things have been headed in terms of what the government and the regulators are hoping to work towards, seems to be going by the national cybersecurity strategy, some recent changes that we've seen in how we'll be approaching liability for scam losses, things like that. It does seem like the Australian government is kind of wanting to push more for larger, more well-resourced entities to be taking on a little bit more of the burden in terms of preventing these crimes, and also even potentially compensating victims for scams, that sort of thing. So it does feel like there's this shift towards, okay, we do want to help individuals protect themselves and smaller organizations to protect themselves as well. But how do we get larger organizations, telcos, banks, the government itself, to take on a larger role in preventing some of this from happening? So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
We're very slow in Australia around cybersecurity. We're probably 5 to 10 years behind established countries like Canada, US, Europe, UK. In the UK now, you're seeing the government push a lot of the responsibility back onto those larger organizations, and particularly the banks, because what's being allowed to happen in Australia is it's very simple for criminals to set up fraudulent accounts. And so when mum and dad are breached and they lose their superannuation, or the young, we're seeing this on the project on a weekly basis. We're seeing it in the news on a daily basis. Young couple lose their deposit for a home because they were deceived, because the real estate agent or the conveyancing lawyer they used was breached, and somebody intercepted, the man in the middle, they intercepted the invoice or the payment, etc. Or mum and dad, or mum's due to go into retirement and somebody intercepted that payment, or they've been scammed in whichever way. That money flows. That money flows through the banks. Personally, I think the banks need to be shaken up a little bit more, to take more responsibility, because it is their institutions that are being used to funnel these funds. So that's money laundering, and it's enabling the criminals to extract this information. It has to flow through banks. Yes, there'll be arguments that a lot of this could be paid, if it's ransomware, it's paid in cryptocurrency. But the scams where people are losing their money are generally transferred to another Australian bank from one to another. Now, is it something that they could do overnight? Probably not. But I think what would be good, what I would love to see, is collaboration between banks, industry, and government. There are a lot of smart businesses in Australia, now really breaching out from artificial intelligence and machine learning. Some of the banks do things well, but I would like to see more responsibility to help these people who are losing life savings, who are losing significant money, because I don't think the banks are doing enough. We talk about the telcos. I think there needs to be, and ASIC are taking this strongly, and so is the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, the OAIC, and they recently signed a memorandum of understanding to say that both entities will now share information to ensure that businesses that do have breaches are investigated now to look at what controls and mechanisms did they have in place, and were they sufficient and fit for purpose based on the size of the industry, their organization, their turnover, and the information that they held. And would the lay person think that that was sufficient? And I think that that's good to see. But I think that the government also and the banks, there needs to be a push to educate customers around this. We educate, but we're a small business. We can't do this. And I think there's not enough education. Yes, there's a start. We've got great organizations like the Australian Signals Directorate, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, ID Care. We've got these organizations and they're putting information out. But in the mainstream for our small businesses, the small business user, they don't know where to go. They often don't know where to start. Where do I start? What should I do? And we can educate the customers that we work with, but there's tens of thousands of small businesses in Australia that simply don't know where to start or wouldn't know where to turn to if something happened. So I think education and awareness, there has to be campaigns. And I think it should also start in schools. We should be teaching youngsters, not just about cyberbullying, but about socials, about how to secure their accounts, about how to protect passwords. I think it has to start there if we really want to make a change. But I think, yes, definitely banks, they're the ones that hold the money. They're the ones that allow that money to transition. There can be better controls and mechanisms. But once something looks a bit suspicious, you're transferring all your savings or you're transferring a large amount of money, well, yes, we could slow that down and do something better. And if the controls and mechanisms then fail at the bank, then I think they should be compensating the customer.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I know that a lot of the banks there is a tension between customer demand for quick, easy, convenient services, but then a lot of times what makes those services very quick and easy for customers also makes them very quick and easy and useful for criminals. And so I think it is heartening to see that there is at least a bit of a shift towards maybe, I guess, putting that back onto the organization that has a few more resources to actually address that. And like you said, is the conduit for that activity in the first place. And so it seems like there is a bit more of a step towards collaboration. You mentioned that this isn't just about banks. It's also about, for instance, educating Australians even from an early age in schools and everything. Yeah. And so it kind of goes back to the idea of there's no single solution. There's no single point of responsibility. But if everybody's kind of stepping up and collaborating, then we've got a much better chance at actually making a difference.
Changing the attitude for us all to say, look, this is a changing culture and awareness and attitude that this crime, so cybercrime, is bigger than all the other well-established crimes put together by tenfold. There are estimates now. So if we look at every single crime from drug trafficking, from human trafficking, organ trafficking, if we look at organized crime, if we put those all together, they sit between $2 to $3 trillion globally. Cybercrime is now estimated to be in excess of $10 trillion. Wow. And it's because it is so simple, because we're not doing a good job. And it comes back to that attitude that should be right, mate. I don't have anything to steal. Nobody will target me. I've got competing priorities. I don't have any money. I don't know where to start. And that has to change because people can make their own assessments. They can say, okay, let's start internally. If we literally have no budget at all, and we could be talking, hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars, not a lot of money. If we've got a business that turns over $100,000, is it worth investing a couple of grand to protect that? I would say yes. Now, even small businesses, if we're into $1 million turnover, then a small proportion should be invested to just go, okay, how do we see our gaps? It could be with your existing internal staff. It could be external with IT. It could be with a cybersecurity specialist. The assessments can be very practical and very affordable. And if they just start there to look at, well, where could our gaps be? What information do we hold? How is it accessed? Because we see simple things. I saw one recently where a company that should have known better, which was in technology, actually had about 7 people in the organization, including developers, that had global admin on their Microsoft 365 accounts. Because the staff said they should have it so they could do things themselves without having to ask IT. And because of that, they received an email, a phishing email that had a malicious link that looked similar to a link that they were expecting. And the criminals were able then to use what's widely known as MFA bypass, using a product that's available on the dark web for about $10, that allowed them to deceive the victim into receiving a proper Microsoft Authentic MFA code, because it went straight, the username and password went straight in. And so the level of investment that the criminals are making into their tools and running their businesses, we're not talking basement people. There might be people who live in a basement and operate crime or have a life of crime. But we are talking Australians. Yes, there's plenty of people overseas, but these Australians are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a month because it's easy, because we're not taking it seriously, and because we're not training staff. And that's why we see the businesses getting breached every day. And the majority, I think, is around 75% of businesses in Australia do not report for fear of reprisal, of governance issues, and brand and reputational damage, and potential class actions against them as well.
Yeah, that's such a tricky part of it as well, because not only do you have that persistent attitude that you've mentioned, but then you also have lack of awareness, because even when there is some awareness because they've been impacted, people aren't talking about it. And so then you've kind of got just radio silence. And one of our other guests has said, how do you even solve this problem if nobody even wants to talk about it? So I think that's really, really good practical. You've given really good practical guidance for how businesses, but also individuals can actually start making some, real, impactful steps now that aren't, spending millions of dollars on hiring a brand new security team within their own organization. These are practical things we can all do. So I guess just to finish us off really fast, I'd love to know, is there anything that you'd want the audience to know about where they can find you, what they should be looking at next? Where can they find out more information about Cyber Audit Team? What would you like them to know?
Yeah, look, we're online. So, we're a Queensland business looking after businesses of all sizes throughout Australia. We particularly like looking after the SMEs, because they're the ones that we recognize need the support. We're very collaborative. So we will work with internal IT, external IT, with the senior leadership team, with the board, across all those vectors. Our website is www.cyberauditteam.com. They can go on there, look at some of the services. They can reach out to myself. And it's just about starting that discussion, because it can start off just with an assessment. It can start off with some free advice like this, listening to your podcast. It's about partnering with people that they can trust and understanding that this isn't transactional. All our customers have been partners for many years. We look at the long-term, not transactional relationship. We become part of their team. Because if something happens to them and they're our customer, then it happens to us and we suffer brand and reputational damage. So partnering with someone that's got the skills, that's got the reputation in the industry, but also someone that you feel as a business that you're going to get on with, because it's like a marriage. You're going to work very closely together. There are going to be things that you agree on and things you don't agree on. So choosing those partners is really important, but having someone that's very flexible and can understand what budget are we working with, what are some of the things that we're trying to achieve, what timeframes, and what's practical and reasonable. Because whilst there could be a risk, what's the likelihood of that risk being exposed? Mm-hmm. So it's having that practical and methodical approach to working with them and making them feel heard. So I'd be happy to work with any customers, and it can start from training. It can start from a free consultation, 30-minute discussion to understand, are we a good fit for each other as well?
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for not only sharing all of this information and these insights, but also sharing, your perspective on, what you've seen over the past many decades of working in this space and getting an understanding of, more of a criminal mindset to a lot of this. So thanks so much, Damian, and really loved having you on the show.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks again for listening to the latest episode of On the Defense. If you'd like to find out more about F-Shore, you can follow us on LinkedIn or head to www.fshore.com. Thanks again.